Good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's session. That is the concluding lecture of the ongoing Rainbow series of online guest lectures. And on this occasion, we have with us a very special guest, a very respected personality of India, of Jharkhand, Dr. Shreya Bhattacharji. Welcome, ma'am. Dr. Shreya Bhattacharji is Associate Professor in the Department of English Studies, Central University of Jharkhand, Ranchi, India. Her academic interests include postcolonial studies, especially African, Afro-American, Caribbean, queer, and women's writing, border and partition studies, and contemporary literary theories. She has published widely and has been invited to numerous conferences in India, as also in the United States, France, Hungary, South Africa, and South Korea. Formerly a civil services officer, she also nurtures a keen interest in human rights, tribal, and gender issues. And today's the topic for today's lecture is locating texts in the post-colonial frame, perspectives, and challenges. We know our students are really thrilled, so am I to hear Shreya ma'am after a very long time. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Varsha. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are. Thank
Varsha,
you.
am I audible? Yes. Uh, Thank you, Varsha, for this invitation, and thank you, Guru Nanak College, for the platform. Without further ado, we will uh, move on to what I have in mind today, and I hope we will have a really interesting session. Varsha, I would like to do a slideshow. So, can I share?
Sure, ma'am, sure, ma'am.
Okay, okay, thanks. Varsha, is it visible?
Yes, ma'am, it is. It is visible.
Varsha, is the slide visible? Right, right. So, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, my dear students and friends. As Varsha just mentioned, today we will be uh, talking and discussing about certain texts, certain theories, and basically, I have titled my presentation Locating Texts in the Post Colonial Frame Perspectives and Challenges. Now, when we want to approach a field such as post colonial studies, the very first thing that one needs to do is to understand what is post colonial. Now, if you want to understand what is post colonial, you obviously also need to understand what is colonial then and what is pre colonial. Now, if we wish to study this phenomenon in a chronological perspective, then obviously you understand that it is colonialism which is occupying center stage. That is, colonialism in the middle, everything that had happened before colonialism goes to the realm of the pre colonial, and everything that happens after colonialism goes to the realm of the post colonialism. That is the most important thing, the defining factor is that of colonialism. Now, if we wish to understand colonialism, one cannot understand it without understanding certain other very complex phenomena. One of them, and the most important one, is that of the phenomenon of racism. Now, we should not make the mistake of thinking that racism is a thing of the past. It is not. And I will argue why it affects our lives very strongly even today. Now, if we want to understand and dissect the phenomena of racism, first we need to understand that race is a construct. It is not a given, it is not a biological given, it is a construct, a societal construct, and any societal construct has certain political and economic dimensions. So does the construct of race. If it is so, then racism obviously is a discourse. Whenever there is a construct, there will be a ground reality on which the construct would be built, and to justify that construct, a discourse will be created. All isms, that's how I look at it, all isms are discourses. And all discourses, as the French theorist Michel Foucault warns us, all discourses are suspect. Why should all discourses be suspect? Because no discourse floats in air. That's not how a discourse operates. Discourses are always located in ground reality. And by ground reality, I mean certain very brutal, certain very violent, certain very exploitative politico economic structures. What does the racist discourse do? It attempted to in the past, and it still continues to justify and legitimize certain unfair, certain unequal, certain violent, certain brutal, certain exploitative eco-political structures. Now, if we want to understand this construct of race, we need to understand the two predominant theories of race. The older one, which was the polygenetic theory of race, and the one which was established by Charles Darwin, that is the monogenetic theory of race. Now, in the polygenetic theory of race, the black obviously was at the bottom, the white at the top, and the whites considered the blacks particularly to be a different species altogether. So if you do not belong to the same species, then you have a justification for exploiting the other species in the same way that humans today think that they have the right to exploit all other species on earth, right? That was the polygenetic theory of race, where the black race was considered to be a different species. Now, with Charles Darwin and with the publication on the origin of species in 1859, we come to the monogenetic theory of race, where it was scientifically proved that all of us, all human beings, belong to the same species, that of the Homo sapiens. Now, there was a problem. If we all belong to the same species, then how do you justify the exploitation of one part of the species by another part? So there was another construct, and this was the construct of the racial hierarchical ladder, with the white man at the top, followed by the white woman. Then you might have the brown man or the yellow man. Below that, the brown woman, the yellow woman, then the black man. And at the very bottom, the rock bottom, you have the black woman. This was as I explained, a societal construct, right? Now, on your right, you can see a picture of the origin of species, which I mentioned was published in 1859. And on the left, you have a photograph of Charles Darwin. Now, this is a very interesting picture Please take a look at it. It is called mm, washing the Ethiopian or the blackamoor white. Okay, and this happens to be the original Pierce soap advertisement, which was published in 1884, and this is based on the Aesop's fables. Now, this concept of washing the Ethiopian or the blackamoor white is a very strong racist prototype. You see, and it dates back right to Greek times. It's nothing new. In fact, if you go to the Aesop's fables, you have a fable where a black slave is being washed. The picture shows a black slave being washed by his new master because he believes that he has a lot of dirt accumulated on him as his former slave master did not treat him right. Now, one version of the story says that this constant washing made the black slave catch a cold and he dies of it, right? Now, this continued, like you have very interesting. You have someone like John Bunyan in Pilgrim's Progress. You have two characters. If you have read that text, you have the fool and you have want wit, and they are shown washing the Ethiopian clean, right? Similarly, in Erasmus, you have the same story. You also have a complementary story of the raven and the swan, where the raven wants the white feathers of the swan, and because he doesn't have it, he kind of bathes and bathes and bathes in the stream and dies as a result of it. Right? In this picture that you see here, you see there is a white child and you see the black child in the tub. And look at in the first picture, and in the next picture, if you look at it, you see the black child is shown with a white body. So this is what the Pierce soap is supposed to do to you. Now, don't make the mistake of thinking that this happened in 1884, because if you have been following the newspapers, you would have seen that Hindustan Lever just a couple of days back has decided that it would remove the term fair from its what should I say? It is its most famous product, the Fair and Lovely cream, and that I'm talking about 2020. And why is Hindustan Lever doing it? Because Johnson and Johnson has decided that it would no longer sell whitening products in India. So you see, there is always a subtext of economic political vantage that one has to understand. So just to explain how racism works and how race as a construct works and how it is alive and kicking even in our times. Now, if we move on to the phenomena of colonialism, this was a phenomenon with very powerful ramifications. If you look at statistics, Europe represents only 8% of the planet's landmass, only 8%. But between 1492 to 1914, Europe had colonized more than 80% of the entire world. Can you imagine? 8% having colonized 80% of the world. And the heyday of colonialism was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The next important point which I would want the students to pay particular attention to is what I like to call the 0 point in history. Now, what is this 0 point in history? You see, it seems in all racist colonial discourse, it seems that the history of a colony begins at that point of time when the white man first sets his foot on a prospective colony. You see, It's almost as if there was no history prior to the arrival of the white man in the colony. Anything that was there, any history of the land and the people prior to the arrival of the white man is neatly and categorically relegated to the realm of prehistory, which by default is the primordial, dark, or the pre-colonial age. Now, look at this photograph very carefully. This is uh, a very interesting and a very famous photograph of it is actually an engraving of by Johannes Stradenus, and it is titled "The Discovery of America." It is that moment where Amerigo Vespucci, the Florentine navigator, first sets foot on America and awakens a sleeping America. You see the way it is imagined, and you see the way it is engraved. Look at Amerigo Vespucci. He is overtly and fully clothed. Look at the image of America. It is a she. America as a continent, as a woman. She is half lying on a hammock and she is naked, right? So it is the colonizer setting foot on the colony which he will colonize in the near future. It seems as if the colony, as a woman, is waiting to be embraced by the colonizer. Now, this is what I like to call the great colonial myth, wherein rape is portrayed as romance. What happened to the colonies in retrospect, all of us know. If you read your history, you know. But the way it has been portrayed in colonial literature and even later is what should interest us and what we should learn to look at critically. So, this is how rape is being portrayed as romance. I will show you another picture. Now, this is again America as woman with a headdress of feathers and an arrow, you see, and which obviously indicates the many indigenous cultures of America who today are all in the reservations. Now, this is another important engraving by Cornelius van Dalen II, who was a Dutch engraver. Look at the background, the landscape. It is a typical indigenous village. This is the third one. This is a personification of America's Gate. This is by Adrian Collard, and he was a Flemish designer and engraver. And here, once again, if you look at the picture carefully, you can see America, once again, a woman, once again, naked, and this time riding on an armadillo. On the left, you can see a kind of warfare going on between the indigenous community. On your right, you can see the colonial occupation has begun. Right? Now, if we move a little further, if we look at the concept of the colonial gaze, the first I just explained to you, how does the colonizer look at the colony? He looks at the colony as virgin land. Continent and woman kind of coalesce, and both of them seem to be waiting to be discovered. That is, to remove the cover, to be deflowered, to be, in a way, it is almost as if the colony as woman is waiting for the great colonial romance to begin. Now, this colonial gaze is also very interesting in the sense that it is partially blind, in the sense that it does not seem to look at the local flora, the local fauna. It is blind. But very interestingly, it can see into the future. It can it can look at the future rubber, coffee, tea plantations, which would dot the to be colonized landscape in the near future. Very interestingly, these are all cash crops, and this would bring in a lot of money for the mother country. This gaze is also very interesting in the sense that it can penetrate deep, very deep, right into the very bowels of the prospective colony. And what can it foresee? It can foresee the establishment of coal, diamond, gold, silver mines. Now, this is also a gaze which renders the local cultures and the peoples invisible. It is almost as if the colonial gaze depeoples the colonized land. There is nothing in the colonized land. There is only miles upon miles upon miles upon miles of fertile land waiting to be converted into plantations or mines or whatever the colonizer deems fit. The local people, the local cultures are completely erased. There is a depeopling of the land. Very interesting, and in a classic case of a colonial twist, the colonized land is then repeopled. Now, repeopled by whom? By the same invisible, erased population. They come back into the colonial narrative, but now they are no longer, the indigenous people of the land. They have become the colonized. And what are they expected to do? They are expected to work in the farms as laborers, in the plantations as plantation workers, or in the mines as miners. So first there is a kind of erasure or depeopling, and this is followed by a repeopling where the indigenous population returns to the narrative as the colonized working population. Now, the next very important concept, and which has kind of fascinated me, is this concept of the cultural baggage. You see, when a colonizer came to a colony, he came with certain preconceived notions of the land and the people that he was expected to govern. You know, and this cultural baggage which the colonizer carried, it kind of rendered him blind. He was unable to learn or to accept the notions of different cultures. If you look at your right, you will see this very interesting book. It is called The People of India. You see, following the revolt of 1857, many civil services officers, such as Temple, they thought that a better understanding of the colonial subject was necessary to avoid future unrest. If you remember Edward Said's Orientalism, he talks about knowledge being power. That is, if you want to govern your native, if you want to control your native within double quote, you must know your native. Knowledge of the native will enable you to govern your native. So what was done? An 8-volume official British government publication was compiled by Watson and Kay between 1868 and 1875. It had 468 annotated photographs about the native castes and tribes of India, and it was called The People of India. What you will be surprised to know is that it was mandatory for each Indian civil service officer to study these 8 volumes before coming to India. Now, you try to understand, an Indian civil service officer coming to India from England would be maybe 26, 27, 28 years old. Before coming to India, he is being kind of compelled to read this. And so he comes with his mind full of these notions about what to expect in India. So obviously, he will not see beyond that. In the next two slides, I will show you four of the annotated photographs from the people of India. See, in this, on your left, you can see one of a classic photograph. It is titled the Dundee, and it is actually that is how they write it. That's how Watson and Kay write it. Hindu devotee. It is in Banaras. On your right, you can see the doshads, and it is qualified as low caste Hindus from Bihar. Now, if I look at the next slide, on your left, you can see the photograph of a woman, and it is of a Lepcha woman. Now, the Lepchas, as you know, today inhabit parts of North Bengal and Sikkim, and also they form part of Bhutan and Nepal. So, a Lepcha woman. And on your right, very interestingly, this is from the Chotanagpur plateau where all of us from Jharkhand are located. And you have a Kol, which we now spell as Kol, but there it is spelled as Cole. And look, they are already Christians. So you see, colonialism has already set in quite well. Now, the next interesting aspect of colonialism is this arrogance of the colonial master. You know, uh, this faith that they had the right to interpret any colonized culture, and moreover, he strongly believed that his interpretation of the colonized culture was the only valid one. Now, if we look at Edward Said's Orientalism, he coins this concept of the positionally privileged. So, if you occupy a positionally privileged place, obviously you get to write your history. And that is what the colonizer does. And his interpretation of history continued to be the only valid one for decades upon decades upon decades. Now, Edward Said, along with Homi K. Bhabha and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, as we know, these three were instrumental in initiating this academic field of post-colonial studies. And uh, I like to think that together they kind of form the holy trinity of post-colonial studies. Now, if you look at this slide very carefully, uh, you will find that in the backdrop there is the map of the world, but it is an upside down map. Now, what I have put in here is Stuart MacArthur's Universal Corrective Map of the World, which was launched in 1979. Here you can see that Africa is at the top, so is South America, and so is Australia. So if the Earth is a globe, if it is a sphere, then who gets to define that what is on the north and so by default on the top, and who are in the south and by default at the bottom? Now, once again, it is, you see, a very interesting politics of cartography, of map making. You know, the maps of the colonial age were made in such a manner that Europe was placed at the top in the north. So, I mean, this is how we need to decolonize. We need to think about these issues. Now, I would also like to talk about certain very, very important and key concepts of post-colonial studies. And one of them is the concept of othering. You, the self and the other. Now, the colonizer was engaged in constructing a binary opposition. The opposition was between the self and the other, the civilized and the savage or the barbaric, the Christian and the pagan or the heathen, and the light versus darkness. Now, another leading post-colonial critic, Abdul Jan Mohammed, in his essay Manichaean Aesthetics, he talks about the dominant model of power and interest relations in all colonial societies is the Manichaean opposition between the putative superiority of the European and the supposed inferiority of the native. You see, so the European is at the top, whether it be the top of the race hierarchical ladder, whether it is at the top of the map of the world, or whether it be at the top of the eco-political structures. And the native is supposed to be inferior and at the bottom. What is even more interesting is the notion of the civilizing mission. Because you see, as I explained to you earlier, what is happening at the bottom, at the rock bottom in real life, is being justified by the ideology that has been constructed by the colonizer and that is floating as the discourse. So, the civilizing mission was the self justificatory ideology that was constructed by the colonizer. How did the colonizer interpret himself in his own narrative? He interpreted himself, obviously, if I write the history, I would place myself in a very positive light, and that is what the colonizer does. He portrays himself as the carrier of light. What does he do? He carries the light of knowledge from the mother country, the center, the metropolis, to the colony, the periphery, the margin, to dispel the inherent darkness there. You see, I have purposely used the uppercase for mother country, center, and metropolis, and the lowercase for colony, periphery, or margin, because that is how the colonial world operated, and unfortunately, that is how the post or neo or ultra or pseudo colonial world in which we live today continues to operate. The next important thing is obviously, which is related to the civilizing mission, is the myth of the white man's burden. Now, this is also very interesting. It is the white man who has the burden of civilizing the pagan or the heathen or the barbaric or the savage, however you want to look at it. Every time I think of the white man's burden, I am compelled to think of another image, that of white Jesus as savior carrying a black cross on his shoulders. Because this again is a justificatory discourse which legitimizes the exploitation of the black colonized by the white colonizer. What is happening in the ground is exploitation. What is being portrayed in the discourse is just the reverse. This is how the colonial discourse is being written, the master narrative or the colonial narrative is being written. Now, another very important concept is that of stereotyping. Now, this stereotyping is something very interesting. You know, and every time I think of stereotyping, there are two things that come to my mind. One is that if you uh, tell a lie 1,000 times, finally people believe it to be the truth. And another proverb, which every time I think about it, I'm also scared. You know, it says that if a language is backed by a gun, I'm sorry, if a dialect is backed by a gun, it becomes a language. What I'm trying to say, in other words, is how does stereotyping work? Now, there are two things. One is, if you can write your discourse well, and obviously you get to write the discourse if you occupy a position of power, and if you can circulate it well enough, it is established as the truth. One of the best examples is is the stereotyping of the entire continent of Africa. You see, it is an entire continent. It has 56 countries and several thousand communities. But how is it reflected in narratives? As one country. It is homogenized as one country. And similarly, all Africans are homogenized as collective beings. An African can be a Zulu from South Africa, an African can be, an Igbo from Nigeria or an Iwe from Ghana, whatever. But no, an African is an African and all Africans are the same. This is how stereotyping and homogenization works. In the Indian context, it's very interesting. You see, prior to the revolt of 1857, when the British colonial machinery, which till then belonged to the East India Company, had a relatively unthreatened rule. And so the portrayal of the adult Hindu colonized male was that of a docile and effeminate man. But you see, with 1857, the entire structure, the British colonial structure, was deeply threatened and shaken. And we know that in 1858, it is the British colonial government which takes over the reins of the government, and Queen Victoria becomes the Empress of India. And the discourse changes. The erstwhile docile and effeminate Hindu male goes on to become sexually excessive and does not stop at that. He also becomes a compulsive rapist. This is how the discourse around the Hindu male is. One, of course, is you can look at the cover page on the right. So Joseph Conrad was ahead of his times. There is no doubt about it. He could see the nasty politics of greed and power which was embedded in the imperial story. He was progressive, much more than most writers of his time. And yet, he stereotyped the blacks and he was blind to the racist structures. And that is why you see his novel is titled Heart of Darkness. Why should Africa be the heart of darkness? Because because the light from the mother country had not reached there. Now, this was written way back in 1899, published in England in 1902, and we come so many centuries down to Binyavanga Vainana, who just passed away last year. He is one of the most brilliant voices in contemporary literature from Kenya. In his short piece, How to Write About Africa, he talks about the prevalent stereotypes in the literature being written today. I will recommend all of you to read it, because it is one of the finest satirical pieces written in recent times about the racist stereotypes and structures prevalent in present day so-called post-colonial literature. Now, if we move further, there is this another interesting colonial tool, that of ascription. Now, what was ascription? Now, this ascription was, the fixing of certain negative characteristics, mostly imaginary, onto an othered or colonized culture to dehumanize it or to demean it. Believe me, it was a very successful colonial tool. One of the most important and most notorious of colonial ascriptions was the ascription of cannibalism onto othered cultures. I have chosen two texts to explain it to you, the concept of ascription. One is Robinson Crusoe's Daniel Defoe. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, and the other is Lee Maracle's I Am Woman. Now, Daniel Defoe in Robinson Crusoe, what does he show? If you have read the text, I'm sure all of you have, you know that Friday's community and the community at war with Friday's community are both shown to be cannibals. Darkness, if you remember, the boatmen who row Marlowe along the river Congo are also shown to be cannibals. Now, one has to understand that cannibalism does not really have a basis. If you read the writings of the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe, he explains it very beautifully. What is the difference between human sacrifice and cannibalism? And he says that when a society has reached rock bottom, its back is against the wall, it is completely cornered. At that time, the god might demand a human sacrifice. It happens in the rarest of rare cases. And when it happens, then the sacrificial meat is eaten by the community. And he says that perhaps the people who eat that meat suffer more pain than the man or the woman who is actually sacrificed. There is nothing like one community hunting and eating another human community for the simple pleasure of eating human flesh. That does not happen. The second example that I have taken is from this text, which is called I Am Woman. And this is written by one of my most favorite writers, Lee Maracle. She is a native Indian writer, that is, an indigenous writer from Canada. In this book, she writes something which gives me the goosebumps every time I speak about it. She says that my community was also demeaned and discourses as a cannibalistic society. And then she goes on to write and say that everything I know today, each art that I know today, has been taught to me by my grandma. And then she says, and my friends, whatever they have learned it from their mothers and grandmothers. And she says, my grandma taught me to cook so many dishes. Now, if human flesh was a delicacy, if it was a delicacy in the community, I'm sure I would have been taught the recipe of cooking human flesh in different ways. How is it that not a single recipe exists? This is the question, a very bold, a very powerful question that Lee Maracle asks, and which obviously makes us think of ascription as a colonial tool to dehumanize or demean the othered cultures. If we move further, now what was the major damage that colonialism did? The major damage caused by colonialism was the internalization of these colonial stereotypes, ascriptions, in fact, the entire negative discourse by the colonized. It is not just that the colonizer, circulated it, propagated it, advocated it. The worst was that the colonized internalized this negative discourse completely. I will give you some examples of this kind of internalization. But before that, I would like to tell you that a similar phenomenon you can see in the internalization of the negative tenets of slavery by the enslaved. It is another very interesting discourse and very closely connected to colonialism. You see, uh, in fact, Maya Angelou talks about it in her autobiography. The Afro-American woman writer Maya Angelou, who passed away last year, she writes about it in her 7-volume autobiography. In the 5th volume, which is based on her travels in Ghana and which is titled "All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes," she writes about how the slavers who should feel ashamed and who should feel the guilt for the crime of slavery do not. It is the enslaved, who feel the guilt. It is a very strange world in which we live, because all the negative tenets of slavery have been internalized by the enslaved, and so it is they who carry the albatross around their necks, the albatross of shame, the albatross of guilt. Now, if we move to the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe's very interesting 1977 essay, An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Achebe says that he grew up reading Conrad, like many of us did, and identifying with the lead character, Marlowe. If you have read Conrad, you know that it is Marlowe who goes on different voyages, and all of us tend to identify with Marlowe. But Achebe says that it was much later, and this is also a case of kind of decolonizing your mind, when Achebe realizes that when you are reading Conrad and when you are a black man, you are not supposed to be Marlowe. You cannot identify with Marlowe. You should identify actually with the black monkeys. They are the homogenized Africans who are shown to be jumping up and down on the banks of the river Congo. And Achebe says that it came as a huge shock to him that this is what Conrad had actually done. Now, to give you another example, and this time the example is from Afro America and from Toni Morrison's classic novel, The Bluest Eye. If you have read The Bluest Eye, you know it is about a 10-year-old black girl child. By black, I mean a child uh, who is very black. In fact, this is what Alice Walker, another very important Afro-American writer, calls the dirty little secret of Afro-American communities. That is, within their own community, there is also the color line. You see, this is how racism functions. The racist tenets have also been internalized by the blacks. And so within the community also there is a demarcation of who can pass off as white, who is high yellow, who is mulatto, who is quadroon, and so on and so forth. And at the very rock bottom, you have somebody like Pecola, who is very black. And she has a 10-year-old child, just a 10-year-old child. She has internalized the white patriarchal paradigm of ideal feminine beauty in such a way that each night she prays fervently to wake up in the morning with a pair of blue eyes. Now tell me, what can be worse? A 10-year-old child praying fervently to wake up in the morning with a pair of blue eyes, and obviously will be associated also with blonde hair and fair complexion and a zero figure. Why would she want to do that? She would want to do that only because without it, she finds that she is not accepted even in her own society, even in her own family. You see, this is how internalization works. Now, I will give you another example. This time, let's come to India and to Lord Macaulay, who, if you remember, was a member of the Governor General's Executive Council and the president of the Committee of Public Instruction. In 1835, he submitted his famous Minutes on Education to Lord Bentinck, and which was passed in 1835. Now, what had Lord Macaulay wanted to do? You know, he had wanted to construct, once again, construct. And this time he had wanted to construct the perfect Brown Sahib. Now, what would this Brown Sahib be like? He would be a puppet parroting individual. In other words, he would be a person who had absolutely internalized the tenets of colonial discourse. That is, he would be white in thought and emotion, but brown in complexion. You see, he would never be the Pakka Sahib. He would always be the Brown Sahib. And what would these Brown Sahibs do? These Brown Sahibs would act as the steel bulwark upholding the colonial structure. Now, if we move further in this discourse of internalization of the colonial discourse, I would like to talk about another very, very important essay, and which I think all of us should read. It is the French philosopher Louis Althusser's essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, where he speaks of two kinds of state apparatuses, the ideological and the repressive. Excuse me. Now, these repressive state apparatuses are very obvious because they are very visible. For example, the police. For example, the prison. The prison with its associated connotations of the panopticon, or the military. But the ideological state apparatuses, Louis Althusser warns, are difficult to locate because they are very surreptitious, they are very subtle, and they are nuanced, and they are almost invisible. And as examples, he gives the family, the places, the religious places. But the most important ideological state apparatus is, he says, the education system. And since all of us are involved in it, I think it is of special importance to us. And he says that the education system is a classic example of the ideological state apparatus, primarily because it teaches an individual what to think, but it does not teach the individual how to think. In other words, it operates just the way Lord Macaulay had wanted the education system to operate, to create Brown Sahibs who would never be the Pakka Sahib and who would be white in thought and emotion, and so help to uphold the exploitative structures. In fact, Lee Maracle, in the book that I just mentioned, I Am Woman, talks of the education system, and she calls the schools, in the Canadian context, she calls the schools ideological processing plants. And she says that when a child enters kindergarten, his mind is like a raw material. But by the time he completes his education, he may be a graduate or a postgraduate, whatever the case might be, he comes out as a finished product, and his mind, she says, is full of, and to quote her, she says, it's full, covered to cover with the colonizers' nonsense. That is how schools as ideological processing plants operate. To give you a very graphic examples, in fact, I could not resist this, to give you a classic example from Satyajit Ray's 1980 film, which in Bangla is called Hirok Rajar Deshe, and in English it's called Kingdom of Diamonds. he shows this concept of internalization in its ultimate, very graphic form. In fact, he shows uh, that this king, who is obviously very rich because it is the kingdom of diamonds, and at the same time he is very exploitative, and like all kings he is surrounded by a coterie of stooges, sycophant stooges, and um, he is threatened by the presence of a teacher who he thinks is teaching uh, the concept of revolution to the young students and also to the minors. And so the king says to his wizard that you have to devise something, and the wizard, who is called Gobu Chandra, which actually in Bangla means a fool, he devises a machine, and this machine is called Mogoj Dholai Jantra. If we translate it into English, it is brainwashing machine. If we translate it into Hindi, it is very easy. It is Magaj Dhulai Yantra, right? And the picture that you see on the right is that of the Magaj Dhulai Yantra. Now, what does the king do? All these rebellious miners, who were shouting down with the king, they are inserted into this machine. The door is closed and there are a lot of weird lights and sounds that you see. And when the door is opened, the same man has been brainwashed and he comes out saying, and you can see it written, Hiroker Raja Bhagavan. That is, the king is God. You see, this is the ultimate portrayal of uh, internalization, of brainwashing. Now, if it was so, how is it that we have a post-colonial age? If colonialism was, so successful in its ramifications, how is it that we can even talk of a post-colonial age? Now, I look at it this way, and I look at these two Derridian gaps. The first Derridian gap was, or chasm, was at the heart of Christianity. I'll tell you how it operated. You see, what did the Christian, European, civilized colonizer want? He wanted to bring light, he wanted to bring religion to the savage, to the barbaric. So, in most colonial countries, either it was the colonizer who went first or it was the missionary who went first. Either missionary followed by colonizer or colonizer followed by missionary. Fine. Now, what did the missionaries and the colonizers wanted to do? One of the main things that they wanted to do was to convert the native to their own religion. Now, herein lies the gap. Herein lies the beauty of the process. That is, if a pagan is converted to Christianity, obviously he also becomes a Christian. So he is no longer a pagan. So if he is also a Christian, if a black is also a Christian, and if the colonizer is also a Christian, then they both become equals in the eyes of Jesus. And now, if both are equal in the eyes of Jesus, the Bible obviously does not permit the exploitation of a fellow Christian. Now, this is where the gap lay, and this gap was utilized by the nationalist movements. Now, there was a similar gap at the heart of colonialism. Now, if you have read your Robinson Crusoe well, and I think it is a text that needs to be read with a lot of care, we find that who learns the language? It is Friday. Friday learns the language of Crusoe. Who converts to Crusoe's religion? It is Friday. You see, obviously Crusoe will not learn Friday's language because he does not even think that Friday has a language. And obviously he will not convert to Crusoe's religion because he thinks Crusoe has no religion. So obviously if Friday has begun to read, He will read everything that Crusoe has. And that is what happened. And I have given just one example. The colonized would not just read what the colonizer had written, he would read more. For example, he would read about the concepts of the French Revolution, the concepts of equality, liberty, and fraternity, and think, why would it not apply to him? This is a question which you would obviously ask. Now, that takes me to Shakespeare's The Tempest, and sometimes I feel that obviously it can be read as the first post colonial text because it is here where Caliban challenges Prospero. And I have quoted two lines from it, that is, you taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. In other words, you have taught me your language and I thank you for it. For now, I will be able to curse you in your own language and you will be able to understand. In fact, what is the point of cursing if the party who is cursed does not understand it? Right? So there is obviously, with this is obviously associated the entire politics of in which language should one write, and that brings us to the debate between Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, where they talk about whether the the erstwhile colonized country writers should write in their own uh, languages or whether they should write in English. Now, from 1940s onwards, you have the era of the nationalist movements. You know, uh, there is a change in discourse because the writing of history has begun from the perspective of the colonized. In fact, if we like to call it post-colonial writing, that had already begun in the last phase of colonialism. And in fact, one of the first examples of that is Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which was published in 1958. If you remember, Nigeria went on to become independent in 1960. On your right, you can see the frontispiece of Things Fall Apart's first edition. Now, the nationalist movements had begun, the writings, had begun, and a nationalist discourse was also uh, constructed and it also began to be circulated. But we as scholars of post-colonial studies, we cannot afford to be blind. We have to filter the information very carefully. For example, these nationalist discourses also show very clear hierarchies. In fact, and this is irrespective of the colonies. The voices of women in almost all discourses, tribals in those societies which are predominantly non-tribal, Dalits in a society like ours, and the lower classes, these are hardly present in the elite nationalist discourses. In fact, Dipesh Chakraborty in his 1992 essay, Postcoloniality and the Artifice of History, who speaks for Indian past, speaks of these internal repressive regimes and asks that all of us need to be aware of these repressive regimes. To conclude, I would like to raise a few questions. Now, when does a country become post-colonial? Does the technical grant of political sovereignty, does it usher in an era of post-colonialism? Like once the country is technically independent, technically sovereign, does it really make the country post-colonial? Post with a hyphen. How can it when the white imported colonizers are today replaced by black or brown or yellow, whatever, homegrown stooges who can be dictators, who can also be Democrats? You know, if this is so, if the structures of violence, if the structures of brutality, if the structures of domination, if the structures of exploitation, if the structures of inequality, if these have not changed, has the country really become post colonial? This is a question which all of us need to think about very deeply, debate about. You know, earlier you see the physical presence of the colonizer was required. Now, even that is not required because in this world of advanced technology, everything is remote controlled by the West, right? So what we have is actually a new era, a new era of neo-colonialism. You can call it neo-colonialism, you can call it, pseudo-colonialism, you can call it ultra-colonialism, whatever you want to call it, because the structures of inequality have not changed. In fact, today there is a rampant economic and cultural invasion, a kind of imperialism from the West. And in this world in which we are living, the world dominated by social media, a world which is called the world of post-truth. In this era, uh, I personally feel the consumer has become the consumable. You do not even realize when you are being consumed by a society which is essentially malignant and invasive. But this is what is happening, right? What has happened is that the terminologies have changed, the vocabularies have changed. It is like a kind of a new packaging that has been given, but the essential structures continue to be repressive. That has not changed. So we perhaps need to think, instead of a post-colonial or a neo-colonial, we perhaps need to think of a post-exploitative era. And perhaps we have to think very carefully as to how to unlearn what we have been, internalizing for centuries, how to unlearn, how to decolonize the mind, how to think further than being located in our own ivory towers. And I would like to conclude with what Arvind Adiga, um, in fact, I have shown the front cover of that. What Arvind Adiga says in The White Tiger, if you remember, he says that if all of us lie on our couches or on our sofas, tuned into our color televisions, and watch uh, the detergent and soap advertisements, and think that the change that we want, the revolution that we want, would come from somewhere else. Somebody else would come to do your revolution for you. That is not going to happen. In fact, that is what Chinua Achebe also says, that your revolution will have to come from your land. It will be slow, it will be piecemeal, it may be haphazard, but nonetheless, it has to come from you. In fact, in other words, you have to be a part of the change that you want to see. Nobody else can do it for you. Thank you. I'm open to questions, comments, observations.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for this amazing classroom experience. You have given us a lot today. And now the session is open for questions. I request the students, friends who have joined here to kindly drop their questions. They can unmute and ask their question too. Any questions?
Hello,
Yes,
good
Kanishta.
evening, ma'am. Ma'am, I have two questions. My first question is, according to Corner, the blacks or the Africans are cannibals, whereas while going through the novel, we find that white people take pleasure in shedding blacks' blood. like we see that massacre that happened there. So is it not that whites are ideological cannibals and blacks are the victims? And my second question is, towards the end of the novel, we find that the last words that Kurt say is the horror, whereas whereas Marlowe says that towards his last time, Kurtz was speaking of his wife. So isn't it that Cornell is trying to he's trying to present the idea in covered words, that during that time obviously it was not possible to write against white people, so he somehow tried to distract people through his writing.
Uh, See, with your first mm, observation, of whites being ideological cannibals, I agree. That is what we have been observing for uh, very long. In fact, I told you that these constructs, these prototypes, these stereotypes, these ascriptions, they have a very long history and they are still continuing. So obviously, it is the white man, who is kind of uh, using his cannibalistic instincts onto the blacks or the browns or the yellows, whatever the case might be. But so far as Conrad is concerned, as I told you, remember, Conrad himself is Polish, but he's white. So if you remember, he was one of the most progressive people of his own generation, and that is why he could look into the into the mockery that was the imperialist process, that he could. But at the same time, one has to remember that one is always located, um, situated with certain affiliations. Uh, so to be completely objective is never possible. And that is why Michel Foucault says that, as I told you, one has to be suspect of all discourse. And that is why, even though Conrad had a fine mind, he could not really overcome the racist structures which were prevalent in his own time, and that is why you have such a depiction of Coates as mistress, for example, or the way Coates is himself portrayed, or as I mentioned to you, the way the blacks are portrayed in the entire text, or even the title of the text. These are issues which we need to think about.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, I have one more question. Ma'am, while I was reading
Yes.
A Taste of Honey, uh, few days back I was reading A Taste of Honey. In that drama, there are two characters, Helen and Joe. Helen sees that her mother is not concerned about color. She's liberal person. She's a radical person. But her daughter Joe, when she gets pregnant by a black boy, she says that she wants to kill her child, and at the same time that boy has left her. And she time and again when they were quoting each other says that there is still jungle in you. Ma'am, is it not that there is kind of biological war going on, that a black person or a black child is a waste to community? They are superior to blacks but they are inferior to whites. Is it, can we think of something like that, that it was going on during that time?
No, I did not get your question. I mean, are you trying to say that there is this inferiority and superiority thing, it exists. Is it what you're trying to tell?
Yes, ma'am.
No, what I was trying to argue was exactly against this. You see that these are all structures, and because these structures have been internalized, they're constructs, they have been internalized so well that you start believing that they are the truth. It is the same, in the case of patriarchy. In fact, many of you must have read The Second Sex, where Simone de Beauvoir says that you are not born a woman, you become one. And how do you become one? Because you internalize all the tenates of patriarchy. In a similar way, racism works in a similar way. You have internalized the tenates of racism in such a way that you have come to associate black with evil and white with good, although there is no reason to do so. In fact, it is just the reverse. But that is how the process of internalization works, and that is why we have to be very careful.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Does that answer your question? Mhm.
Yes,
Mhm.
ma'am.
Thank you, Ganeshta. Any more questions, please?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am, I have one question. Hello? Hello?
Yes,
Yes.
please go ahead.
Yes.
Uh, Ma'am, as Fanon explained that white man is still in his whiteness and black man in his blackness. So there is a two vicious circles, and white man wants to prove his superiority, and black man wants to talks about his past, that we have a very glorious past. So there is a two vicious circles. So how will overcome these two vicious circles?
Yeah, it is. That's what I said, na, that one has to uh, unlearn. The first thing that is about education is about not learning. It is about unlearning. All the stuff that has been drilled into your mind. You need to unlearn those things. That is the first thing that one needs to do. That is what Gugui Bothiongo talks about also in about when he talks about decolonizing the mind. You see, if you were talking about Frantz Fanon, what does he say? He says that uh, if one human being hates another human being for a certain reason, it is valid. But if an entire community hates me because of the color of my skin, is there any logic in that? That community does not even know me as an individual human being. That community recognizes me as a collective being. All Africans are black, so by default all Africans are evil. So obviously you understand that there is no logic in it. There is no scientific substantial, it cannot be scientifically substantiated, nothing of that sort. So the the human mind has been very carefully damaged by this kind of colonial master narratives, and so we have to learn how to overcome this. And that is what Achebe says. That's why I give you that example. He says that I thought I was Marlowe, and it was only later that I realized that I was not Marlowe. I was one of those black monkeys jumping up and down on the banks of the river Congo. So that is the moment of realization. You have to learn how to decolonize your own mind. Uh, uh, I hope I answer your question.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I have another. I done just want to another explanation. So as we are colonized country as India, so we are in the process of decolonization. We entered in the process of decolonization.
That we are still very colonized. In fact, I tell my students, some of them might have joined also, that look at your location. You are located at a place called Brambe, which is very close to the capital city of Ranchi. It happens to be in the Oraon or Kuduk heartland. Okay, 5 kilometers from the university, you have the Mudma Jatra, which happens every year on the 6th day after Dashami, that is Durga Puja Dashami. But almost none of the students know the significance of the Mudma Jatra. How do they envision the Mudma Jatra? It is a place to go and just enjoy the fair and come back. None of them know that this is a, there is the Dharam Khuta there, which unites all the sub communities of the Oraons and the Oraon and Munda community, and that there is a host of stories behind it. It is the focal point of two communities. They do not know. They would stay there 5 years, maybe more, and go away without knowing. Why is that? That is because of the cultural baggage that we all carry. Believe me, we are all racists. We are, each one of us is a blatant racist. The students would come, the students would study in the university for 5 years, and then they would go away without knowing these things. Why? Because they think there is nothing to know. What is there to know from these places or these people? You are already ensconced in your superior ideology. You have to begin at home, just like charity begins at home. Decolonization also begins at home. You have to begin with your own mind. This is how it begins. You have to be more perceptive. You have to see around you. You cannot lock yourself up and practice decolonization. It doesn't happen that way.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Any more questions? More questions? Okay. Ma'am, there is a question from Richa in the comment section, if you can check. So she writes, Richa has written, Gayatri Spivak says that
Yes, please.
it is more important to redistribute than to learn. What does she mean by redistribution? Has academia made the concept of post-colonial just another consumable product?
Sometimes, I I feel so, that in this kind of a consumerist society, where individuals are being converted into consumables, obviously, any discipline, that is also up for consumption. And we all sit and debate. We all sit and debate, and we talk about redistribution. But to me, it seems, that redistribution can only happen after unlearning. Unless you unlearn, that is one, and unless you connect, number two, you know, things are not going to work. You can, in fact, I was listening to a very interesting lecture by some stalwarts on queer studies just a few days back. And I was thinking that what is the significance of talking about who gets to write in English and who gets to write in the vernacular, when the average when the average hijra in the rural societies of India suffers each day, each night, multiple times. You see, so where is the connect? Where is the connect? And if we do not connect, obviously these will become products that will be up for sale, and just like your intelligence will also be up for sale. In fact, uh, Richa, on a personal note, I feel, that I can forgive everything, but I cannot forgive uh, uh, those intellectuals who are willing to sell their intelligence as a consumable, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. It does. Thank you, Richa. So I think we don't have any more questions. Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
Noshaba.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes,
Hello.
please go
Yes.
ahead.
Okay, ma'am, can we trace the essence of operation from Victorian age or before that? Because I have read in many novels such as Samuel Richardson's Pamela, Oliver Twist's Dickinson Oliver Twist, or in Pygmalion, G.B. Shaw's Pygmalion. There was a class distinction between higher class and lower class, and but now the distinction is between blacks and whites. So, ma'am, please put a light in this context.
No, no. I wish it was as simple as that. It's not like that. These all these are intertwined. There are. Uh, it is not as if there is only the race division. Of course, there is this black and white, but along with that, there will also be the dimension of class, the haves and the have-nots, as Franz Fanon would say. There would also be the gender dimension, the patriarchal structures. There will also be the religious structures. There will also be the the sexual orientations. These are all very important dimensions of society, and they all work together in tandem. It is not this or this or this. Unfortunately, you have to face all of these together. In fact, I would like to illustrate with an example from Alice Walker's The Color Purple, where uh, when Celie, the central character, decides to leave home, her husband, Albert, who is a patriarch of the worst order and also a wife batterer, he says, what can you do? And then he qualifies it by saying, you poor, you woman, you black, you nothing. Do you understand? You poor, that is class, you black, that is race, you woman, that is gender, and together you nothing. This is how it works, together. It doesn't work in compartments. That is the tragedy.
Okay, ma'am.
Thank you, Noshaba. I think that was the last question. Okay. Uh, Noshaba, you can mute yourself, please. So, thank you very much, ma'am, for being so patient and for your time, for your cooperation. This was the last lecture of this series, and I believe nothing would have been a better conclusion for this series than your lecture. It was absolutely delightful for all of us, and I think the students have got to understand a lot today. They are quiet because I think they're usually quiet when they take in a lot of stuff. Otherwise, they are they behave somewhat different. But today they are quite differently quite, which means that they have absorbed a lot today. And yes, there are amazing comments coming up for you, ma'am. So thank you very much for this beautiful session. Thank you for taking time for us. It means a lot. I know that you keep really busy. You have been absolutely stuck with a lot of things, but you took time for us. It means a lot to us. So thank you very much, ma'am, for being with us today.
Thank you, Varsha. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This was the last session of the ongoing series. And with this, we come to an end of the complete series. We will be back with some more interesting stuff very soon. But till then, take care. Goodbye. Thanks a lot, everybody.